and Ambassador Shyam Saran for giving us this opportunity and platform. Communications or media has always been central to democracy and its institutions. I recently watched a movie called Rag Desh, which focused on the first Red Fort trials of 3 Indian National Army soldiers who were tried for treason by the British. Even in the movie, the British tried to censor the airing of Subhash Chandra Bose's speeches on the radio and coverage by the BBC to control the public discourse and mood. The forms of communications have evolved and expanded over time, but it remains critical nevertheless. Social media in particular has only emerged and grown as we know it today, a little over a decade now. However, it has increasingly been playing a role the world over in reshaping perceptions that have propelled social and political outcomes. This surge of digital communication has also been the vehicle for the proliferation of fake news through various social media channels. There are several questions around how this fake news is generated, the pace at which it spreads, its impact and regulation. I've come across articles in mainstream media like The Guardian about a data analytics firm called Cambridge Analytica, in which notable right-wing billionaires have stakes, that has collected and analyzed individual digital footprints to psychographically map voters and carry out targeted, mostly propagandist messaging to swing electoral outcomes, used specifically in the US elections and the Brexit vote. What makes this even more dystopian is that the common person does not even know the ways in which he or she is being surveyed. However, let me add an important caveat. While the role of social media and political mobilization, the topic for today's panel discussion, cannot be ignored, it is not the only factor influencing political outcomes. Politics is much more complex. While it may not be possible to measurably apportion the role played by social media, it is certainly important enough for all of us to make an attempt to understand it further, to deconstruct how it works and what are the ways to address it. Today's discussion is an attempt at our end to do just that, to break it down for all of us with a focus on India, to hopefully amplify the conversation around this subject and explore solutions. The first hour will have each of the panelists talk about their topic for about 10 minutes, and we hope we'll have a lively question and answer round following that for the remaining time. A couple of panelists are still to join us. They're stuck in traffic, but let me begin by calling on Dhruv Arora, my colleague, the Digital and Strategic Communication Manager at the Center for Policy Research, who will really set the context, talk about how social media technology propagates binaries, what are the economic incentives that drive it, and how it drives political discourse.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, Richa. And thanks everyone for joining us here tonight, this evening. I think this is sure to be a fascinating discussion, and I'm quite excited to hear what my fellow panelists have to say on the matter. I think I'd like to start off by talking a bit about the popular social media platforms, their scale and their usage. Of course, there are quite a lot of social media platforms available to us today, but I will mostly be talking about Facebook and Twitter, but mostly concentrating on Facebook as one of the platforms that we'll be discussing. So now, according to their official numbers of the platforms themselves, Facebook currently sees about 2 billion monthly active users. That's quite a lot. And out of which India has the largest user base on Facebook currently, which is about 241 million. And right behind, US is right behind us at 240 million. We recently passed them, and we continue to grow as a country because a lot of our citizens are still getting access to internet, and it's rapidly growing. Twitter, on the other hand, is at 328 million monthly active users, according to their own platform. And I should also mention WhatsApp here because it is actually one of the largest messaging apps that is used in this country. And especially in terms of when we're discussing political sort of campaigning and mobilization, it is one of the prime examples of apps that are used, social media apps that are used to really mobilize towards a certain political objective in various different ways. And I'm sure my fellow panelists, Bhanu and Parag, will discuss a little bit more about how political parties specifically utilize these platforms, especially with WhatsApp and Facebook. Now, over the past decade, we've seen a very sharp rise in the use of social media as a very active tool to campaign on, especially for political parties. This is not just in India, across the world, but most notably seen in India in the last general elections by the BJP. They really sort of did a lot of targeting outreach on various social media networks. But now when we move past the numbers, I think let's talk a little bit more about how people experience these social media platforms, what their experiences are like. And as some of you may know, a lot of these social media platforms have various algorithms, depending on each platform, that they use to present content to its users, which is all of us. It's not as simple anymore as it used to be earlier, which is, as soon as the content is generated, you see it. It's not as simple anymore. While Twitter mostly works on that same basic principle, which is, as soon as something is tweeted, people get access to that tweet, people are shown that tweet. Facebook has made a very conscious step away from, taken a very conscious step away from this kind of content curation, and has actually employed a lot of very specifically designed algorithms which are heavily biased towards increasing user engagement more than anything else. Now, basically these algorithms decide, when, how, and which kind of content will be shown to whom, and it's very different from how Facebook was even, say, 5 years ago. Now, these algorithms essentially are a calculated bit to ensure that the users are incentivized to interact with the content as much as possible. Editorially, there is not much thought that actually goes into these algorithms. All that Facebook's algorithms look at is how it can incentivize its users to click on as many posts as possible, share as many posts as possible, and like and what have you. This is the biggest reason for this, is because the revenue for Facebook is directly tied to how many posts its users interact with, and that therefore gives them an incentive to incentivize this for the users as well. And I think that's how it keeps on going from there. Now the question is, how do these algorithms work? The answer is based around a simple principle that instead of showing you all of the content as it is generated in your network, a network that is created by you, connecting with people and pages that matter to you, these algorithms work in overtime to analyze what kind of content and consequently what kind of opinions you are interacting with the most, you're engaging with the most. And by interacting and engaging, whenever I'm going to be using these terms, essentially what I'm talking about is you actively liking or sharing something, and not as simple as you just looking at it. Now, once they're able to identify what are these set of subjects and opinions that you interact with the most, Facebook's algorithms then curate posts with similar opinions and subjects and then present them to you, the user. Even if you made the conscious decision to follow a specific page, for example, if you thought you would be interested in the content that that page puts out, the chances that whenever that page puts out a post is shown to you is less than 20%. That's how the algorithms work now. So it mostly depends on what Facebook thinks that should be shown to you, as opposed to what the page is putting out, even if you followed it, right? So this kind of algorithm creates what has come to be known as a filter bubble. A filter bubble is the term coined by an internet activist called Eli Pariser back in 2011 in his book by the same name. And it is essentially a personalized view of the internet created through algorithms on social media. Increasingly, users are shown more of what the algorithm thinks that they want to see, effectively gating people off opinions and subjects that they might otherwise disagree with or not interact with. This creates a political bubble for them and sort of propagates binaries even more on social media. Over the past decade, this has played an increasing role in creating political content aimed at increasing this binary division, not just sort of informing its users, but also getting them to click on it as much as possible. And this could be seen in action very well in the last US elections. And talking about those US elections, I think many people believe that the propagation and the spread of what has come to be known as fake news played a significant part in securing the victory for the Republican candidate, Donald Trump. A recent study published in the Stanford Journal of Economic Perspectives defined fake news as articles that are intentionally and verifiably false, that are created to mislead its readers. These news articles, if you want to call it that, intentionally crafted to spread misinformation, specifically pertaining towards political objectives, were spread via fake news websites, which were usually named after mainstream news platforms which already exist. So, for example, one of the false news websites was called DenverGuardian.com, after The Guardian, I'm sure you've heard of. And the study also revealed that while a majority of the traffic coming to these legitimate mainstream news websites such as The Guardian were direct visits, basically people entering their URL directly into their browsers and looking for news, for the fake news websites, a majority of the traffic was originating from social media websites. This clearly demonstrates the importance of these algorithms that I was talking about. on social media to spread misinformation and promote these fake news platforms. Now, very quickly, I want to talk about a few more studies that looked at different aspects of how users engage with social media. A 2015 study collaboratively done by the University of Illinois, California State University, and the University of Michigan suggested that more than 60% of Facebook users were entirely unaware of any curation at Facebook at all, believing instead that every single story from their friends and followed pages appeared on their newsfeed. Now, this is a big problem because this creates a very large disconnect between what I expect to see on my newsfeed and what I'm actually seeing on my newsfeed. This can really sort of derail my opinion as far as what I might actually believe and what Facebook's algorithms are leading me to believe. Another study found a lag of approximately 13 hours between the production of misinformation and fact-checking, which allows enough time for the false news to really propagate and even become viral at certain times before it is even fact-checked. And the problem is that even after they are fact-checked, the fake news spreads much farther and much faster than the articles which are debunking the same fake news. So it's more than likely that people who have read the fake news will not actually read the debunked article which will talk about this fake news. Yeah, absolutely. So I think, so now let's quickly talk about some solutions which have been proposed. There have been some solutions. I think one of the primary solutions that has been proposed is there are various platforms that fact check these fake news articles that keep coming up, such as Hoaxy, which is a platform launched by researchers at Indiana University, and other platforms such as Snopes and Youth Ki Awaaz, which Anshul will be talking about. But the real problem is that fake news, as I mentioned, propagates much faster and farther than these articles fact checking them. Also, there is not a lot of actual real data on how these specific algorithms work. We know a basic idea of how they function, but we don't have a detailed description of what these algorithms are and how they are actually working. I think when Anshul and Tamsil talk about how these platforms are experimenting with citizen and youth engagement in an attempt to counter these false narratives, you'll get a bit more on that. But I should mention that there are currently no native mechanisms built into any of the major social media platforms to address the spread of fake news. Another, very quickly, a solution that has been touted is regulation of content, but there is no consensus on where and on whom the onus of regulation will lie. And there are many valid concerns about the risk it poses to basic freedom of speech. Most internet activists believe that the regulation of content will hamper the free and open internet more than it will help control the spread of misinformation, which is something Apar will discuss further. Thank you.
Thanks, Dhruv, for explaining how Facebook and social media technology actually creates political echo chambers. I'll now actually... Yeah, why don't you explain the algorithm?
So the algorithms are basically, it's a script at Facebook's end which looks at how the users are engaging with the content. Essentially, if I'm putting out a piece on, say, how BJP sort of reached out to the youth and how it was immensely popular with the youth, and if I agree with it, if I like it, and if I share with it, what Facebook will see is I like this kind of content. The algorithm will keep noting these likes and dislikes that I'm doing, likes and shares that I'm doing, and will present more such content to me, even if I haven't followed the pages that are posting this content. This is essentially what an algorithm is.
I mean, another word for it could be formula?
Essentially.
Yeah.
Formula in action.
Yeah. So I'd like to now call upon Parag Mohanty, who is a political consultant who's actually worked with political parties in India on political campaigning through social media, and share his experiences about how it is actually done.
As Dhruv was mentioning that political parties are increasingly using social media for campaigning, but at the outset we need to understand the user base in India, the people who use social media. It's very limited, even though the numbers sound staggering, but compared to the total population of the country, the numbers are still very limited. And contrary to popular belief, in fact, even today, a lot of political parties still rely on offline sources of collection of data. But in the next 2 or 3 years, these numbers are really going to change drastically, and we are already seeing a change there. So as Facebook, Twitter, and all these portals penetrate into rural areas, more and more political parties are going to start collecting data from Facebook and Twitter. And Dhruv has mentioned some already about how engagement helped by the Facebook algorithm helps people, at least helps Facebook understand what is this person going to like, or what this person prefers reading, or what this person finds useful. There are three things. You might like something, you might want to get more of that information, or you might believe that information, you might find it useful to share it again. Now, what most political parties do today, there's some of the methods are very direct. They will start a page on Facebook, and if you like the page, if you engage with the page, they will get your information because they have direct access to your profile. Some of the other things that Facebook probably does not allow, it's a gray area. It's scraping public profiles. For example, if you have a public profile, a lot of people, especially in rural areas, they are not very concerned about privacy, so their privacy settings are turned off. So they will have their interests, they will have their status messages. In fact, until last year, if you are not a Facebook user, you could still see people's public information which is posted on Facebook. There was a site called Open Book, which when you post something on Facebook, you say make it public only to friends or friends of friends. There are these options. So when you say it's public, what Facebook meant was it's public to everyone on the internet. If you have an internet connection, it is public to all of them. So what Open Book used to do is, Open Book used to scrape through all of that data and used to post it. And Open Book was a joke because they used to post only the funny status messages posted by people. But what it enables political parties who are tech savvy to do is they can use bots to scrape this data. So they can find out that person X belonging to so and so town or village is interested in so and so books, is interested in so and so movies, is sharing this kind of content, is engaging in this kind of content. So that's one way. The slightly more indirect way of collecting information is, I'm sure most of you must have come across quizzes on Facebook. What Harry Potter character you are, or which Friends character you are, or something like that. Now, when you are going through these quizzes, there will be some questions which will give somebody who is looking at the results of this quiz an insight into your political beliefs. For example, there could be a question like, if you see somebody getting attacked, will you call the police or will you jump in to help that person? Now, this may be relevant in a Harry Potter quiz, but it also tells the person who's looking at the results something about how you behave in situations that involve other people. Now, this helps people make decisions about, is this person proactive, or is this person a rule-abiding citizen, or is this person somebody who is aggressive? So a lot of profiling can be done through this kind of information. Now, once on Twitter, for example, there are bots, and it's okay, I should clarify, I'm not a technical person. I work with some of these things, but I don't know exactly how the technology works. But in Twitter, if you've shared or tweeted about something, the bots can actually scrape and save that data. So if you tweeted something about Aadhaar, the bot will know that you are interested in Aadhaar. It may not make that judgment call as to whether you favor Aadhaar or you are against Aadhaar, but it will know you are interested in Aadhaar.
Yes, 5 minutes.
So once this information is collated and collected, what the next step is, how do you target these people? So there are 6, and I'm going to refer to users as voters because that's how political parties look at users. So voters are segmented into 3 broad categories. One is, okay, these guys are going to vote for this party. So the party decides beforehand, these guys are voters I have captured. These are captured voters. So what the content they will see, and this Facebook actually aids this, like Dhruv mentioned, the content they will see on their Facebook feed is sometimes, have you seen boost posts if anybody's ever run a Facebook page? So the boosting the post actually does this. Facebook aids this. When you boost a post, Facebook finds all the people who might be interested in that content, and for a small fee, it shows them that content. So when you boost a post, you can use certain filters to make sure that the content that you are sharing goes to people who are already your captured voters. Now, what political parties want to do with that is they want to use these people as influencers. So they already know that some of these people who are on the pages they are running are influential, they have more friends, they have followers. For example, on Twitter, they have followers. So they want them to retweet, reshare, post it on their profile. So that's the step one for the captured voters. Then there are fence voters. With fence voters, what they try and find out is what is the sentiment. Is there a sentiment of anti-incumbency, or is there a clear preference slowly showing even though they are undecided? And in that case, they try and target issues which will turn a fence voter into a converted voter or otherwise, right? So when they target them based on issues, the messaging is done clearly. So for example, if the person said that, okay, I won't wait for the cops, I'll jump in and help them. So the message that person will probably get is, the future of your country or the state is in your hand. This is happening. You have to jump in and you have to vote. Your vote matters. Your vote counts. So there's a sense of urgency to that message. And then there is a third kind of voter. This voter is basically not going to vote for you no matter what. So no matter how convincing your arguments are, or how good your campaign is, this voter is not going to vote for you. So there are two ways of dealing with it. Either they start trying to counter some of these things, reduce the influence of this voter group. So for example, if you're sharing an article which goes against the political party who is doing this exercise, they will try and debunk some of these things. So this is where sometimes trolling comes in, right? So you post an article, somebody comes and starts trolling you. Now this is something that is very targeted. It doesn't happen in vacuum. And then secondly, otherwise you just decide, okay, this is a lost cause, I'm not going to waste any money or time trying to influence this voter. So that takes care of the three voter segments. But the most important thing is that we should remember is that this is a very small part of the whole political process. And this is something that we observe very clearly because we use Facebook, Twitter regularly. If you look at Uttar Pradesh or any of the big states in northern India or in eastern India, the penetration of Facebook and Twitter is very low. Internet penetration is very low. People don't engage that well with articles. Like fake news probably won't work in Uttar Pradesh because most of them, if you're creating fake news in English, most of them won't read through a 2-page long article. They won't make sense of it. So something Dhruv mentioned was WhatsApp. WhatsApp plays a big role there. In India, the future, if India is going to go the US way, it is going to probably be fake videos, not fake news. And with fake videos, there is no way of measuring or predicting where the video came from. With Facebook, at least you can trace there is an origin, there is a publication which published. But with a fake video which is circulating on WhatsApp, there is no way you can trace it, where it came from, who spread it, where it's gone. And every major political party in India today runs WhatsApp groups, and they get 200 people onto each group, and then they in turn spread things in their groups. So it's a huge unregulated thing. So some of the suggestions that Dhruv was suggesting will not work at all in a situation like that. So it's a very different context there altogether.
Okay. Thanks, Parag. I think people might come back to you for more questions later. So now I'd like to call on Bhanu, who actually did a lot of fieldwork in recent state elections in 3 states. And he'll give it a theoretical perspective from a political science background, and also share examples of what actually Parag was mentioning from his field notes.
You can put this, the presentation here.
forgot to mention, he also is a colleague at CPR.
Can open the PDF. Yeah, this one. Close. Got it. Probably need it. No. Go to home. Okay, let's take this then. Good evening. I'm sorry for the inconvenience here. So the year 2014, in a sense, was a watershed in Indian politics, right? When we talk of politics in India, we basically talk of three distinct phases. There was the Congress era, which almost ended by the late 80s. Then you had the Mandal and post-Mandal era, which sort of went on till the late 2000s. And then 2014 was, in a sense, recognized as the, Narendra Modi era. It was the year in which digital technology and data combined to produce an election, which saw some very interesting patterns. One of which was, of course, direct interaction of the leaders with the masses. There was lots of constituency level mapping and electoral roll were used to do that. So that is essentially the context in which this presentation is based on. Okay. So this table here lists about 5 state elections which Nilanjan Sarkar, Ashish, who's somewhere in the audience, and myself have done some field work in. And what this table essentially shows you is that the different states, whether the election was for Vidhan Sabha or Lok Sabha, and whether professional managers were hired officially or unofficially, and whether there was a usage of tech solutions. Now, of course, I'm very much cognizant of the fact that I'm using technology here as a very vague term, but essentially what I mean when I say usage of tech solutions, I mean whether electoral rolls were used, mapping was done, and when I talk about social media, I'm talking about, just like what Parag said, WhatsApp and Facebook. There are very little Twitter and other sort of social media which we saw when we were in the field, right? What I would like you to concentrate, however, on is the winners, the last column here, right? As you can see that barring the Lok Sabha election, of the other 5 elections which we went to, Congress won, or Congress plus 1 in 2, and BJP plus 1 in 2. Of course, Bihar now is a completely different scenario. But let's just keep the last column in mind to then move on and ask us the question of, which is what we are here for, which is that, does campaign affect people's voting preferences, and whether digital, online and offline media is affecting electoral preferences and outcomes in this country. So I would give 3 sort of broad arguments on what I have seen in the field and what political theory also sort of suggests when it comes to electoral preferences. How do people vote has been of substantial interest to a lot of scholars, people, and generally people who are interested in politics, right? What we saw when we were in the field recently is that, number one, there's this emergence of a new electorate which we fully don't understand. And when I say this new electorate, I mean that India is a deeply diverse society. We have linguistically distinct regions. we have a deeply politicized religious cleavages, we have an elaborate social hierarchy, caste as well as class, right? Now, while it is broadly recognized that these cleavages have defined and have shaped India's politics, how the reshaping of these cleavages has shaped politics is not very well known. And I'll give you two examples of this. The first one, of course, is which I cited here as well, is this book which was written by Tariq Thachil in 2014 called Elite Parties, Poor Voters, How Social Services Win Votes in India, where he talks about the BJP in Madhya Pradesh and how the BJP sought to expand the party's electoral support by funding small social service schemes like one school teachers, free service delivery in terms of healthcare, so on and so forth, particularly amongst the lower castes. The second example is our own work, which is also a paper called Deconstructing the Muslim Vote in Assam, where we debunk the idea of a well-coordinated, consolidated Muslim vote bank, as understood by a lot, and we also provided insights into competing political appeals at the Congress, AIUDF, and sometimes in special cases, the BJP also has to the Muslims in Assam, which, as many of you know, are divided by not only region, but language, and also the way they practice the religion.
Only 5 minutes.
Okay. Second aspect, so the first aspect is that there is this electorate which is changing. The second aspect is volatility. Volatility amongst Indian voters is becoming an increased marker. And when I say volatility, I mean that every election, the voter is assessing and reassessing its vote choices. And we have seen this in Delhi, we have seen this in Assam, we've seen this in West Bengal, Bihar, UP, so on and so forth. Now, between these two sort of concepts of a very malleable electorate, which is reassessing its choices, political parties have this pressure to reach an audience quickly and effectively and to reach to maximum people, right? At the same time, they're also confronted by budget costs, which in a sense explain why there has been a quote-unquote professionalization of election campaign in India, which Parag very elaborately mentioned. And I think social media is sort of a part in that large sort of game. So to conclude, the question, I guess, is then, does social media change electoral preferences? My guess is that it is not the case. But again, as many of us know that elections and electoral preferences are various kinds of things happen. Let me then give two examples. The first one is that in the Bundelkhand region in Uttar Pradesh, which is very close to, it almost borders Madhya Pradesh, there was a Muslim village in which our team reached for our usual sort of electoral work, and we found that there were pamphlets which were being distributed. And the pamphlets essentially had, the front part of it had the name of the elector, along with a small passage on what are the issues in Bundelkhand and who the local candidate is. And on the reverse side of it had Mr. Modi and Mr. Amit Shah, along with what their larger sort of larger manifesto for UP is and what they have done for the country in the last 2.5 years that they've been around. The point that I'm making is that this example is important because it illustrates 2 points. Number one, that there is no substitute for party workers and face-to-face interaction in politics. As much as we want to talk about social media and how it mobilizes politics, the fact remains that BJP won Assam and UP because their troops on the ground were very well coordinated with those people sitting in the back room and channeling and funneling the data to those teams. As a matter of fact, as Parag and other people in the audience would also know that both in Assam and UP, the BJP started working 2 years in advance, way before most parties had even started deciding on their candidates. And the second example, which is these images from one is from the Bihar election, the second one is from that's a comic titled it's a book, not a comic, a book titled Bal Narendra. and both of these were circulated during the Bihar elections. You can find them online as well. But the context here is that localization of an election, which some political scientists have called as plasticity of language, that can you bring political ideologies and languages within the context in which people talk, in which they frame politics, in which they would like to discuss politics. And I think these images are interesting because this is something that I got off WhatsApp during the UP election. This was during the Bihar election in 2015. So let me conclude by saying that 2014 was a watershed year, right? After that, we've had 5 elections. Election and election campaign is all about persuasion. The data, sort of the scheme in which the data and the all of these sort of media work is a very small part in that persuasion game. Until and unless there are a variety of local factors, which includes cleavages, includes local leaders, etc., come into play, there is very little that social media can achieve. Thank you.
Thanks, Bhanu. I think, as I said in the beginning, we can't really measurably apportion the amount of the role that social media plays. It still cannot be ignored. Thanks for providing the larger picture. I'll now call on Anshul to actually speak a lot more about fake news in India, how that drives political discourse, and what are the possible solutions.
Thanks, Richa. So, my name is Anshul. I run a digital media platform called Youth Ki Awaaz. Just to give you an idea of about fake news. So, fake news is a very recent term when it comes to us talking about it in a very clear political sense. I think it's just been the last 2 years that fake news as a terminology has really come about on social media, and it's taken on mainstream news as well. So just, I mean, there is actually no clear way to understand how large or how massive the impact of fake news is, but I'll actually give you a couple of real examples of what fake news really looks like. So there is a video that's been circulating on social media, especially actually using WhatsApp for a very long time. It's a video of a group of men beating a young woman. And it's a mob lynching kind of a case, and it's been, I think, a little over 6 months that this video has been circulated. When we try to analyze and see how much this video has been circulated, we realize that in all, the amount of circulation that we could map, we saw that at least 50 to 60 million views is what that video had attained through different pages, through different platforms, and so on. And obviously, we could tell primarily based on the views we saw on Facebook. What happened through WhatsApp was not something we know of. The message that was circulating with this video was that this is a Marwari girl who's being beaten up by a mob of Muslim men. And on a little bit of research, if you just take a screen grab of the video and do a Google search of that screen grab, you'll actually find the original video, which is a video from Guatemala. It's actually not an Indian video, and it's been in circulation for a very, very long time. And now if you see the comments on that video, you'll realize that 80 to 90% of the people are actually extremely angry. They are dropping very vicious comments about different communities, and people from all sections technically are participating in this online violence. Now, what this shows us is that there is a clear threat that we have, which is that content that is actually not real, that does not have that has not had a real world implication on our country, is actually circulating and is having very real world implications today. The second bit about this particular video is that a lot of people actually have countered this in the comments, if you see, and you'll realize that people are actually posting the original video, posting news reports about the original video. But a very interesting research done at the Stanford University and a couple of other places actually says that in only 2% of the cases when you have consumed fake news and you find out that it's fake, do you actually end up realizing that you were wrong? So in most cases, what ends up happening is that the moment you realize the news was fake, it actually does not change the way you think about the community that you're looking at. It does not change the way that you're looking at the incidents that are happening and so on. So the interesting fact about fake news is that it has a deep impact on the way you think and the way you consume content, even when you find out that what you just consumed was fake. It's interesting that Bhanu gave an example of Bundelkhand, because I also have an example from Bundelkhand where, so we work with a local media partner there called Khabar Lahariya, and they did a story on Youth Ki Awaaz recently about a WhatsApp video that was circulating of a Muslim man who was harassing a young woman. But the way it was circulating was in a small village in Bundelkhand was that people said clearly that this person lives in that house. There was one Muslim family living in that village, lives in that house, and is this particular person. And within 2 days, there were mobs outside his house. His family had to take him away from there, take him to a safe space somewhere outside of the village. And the video again was found out to be actually from Pakistan. So it wasn't an Indian video at all. But still the mob believed it. Even when the cops told them that this is not a real video, they kept at it. They continued believing it, and eventually the family had to move out of Bundelkhand completely to avoid any kind of harm that could happen to them. Now, how this translates into politics is also very clear, because the moment a piece of fake news or a fake story is being circulated, it is obviously tapping into your communal beliefs, so to say. And the moment you see a political party that represents what you believe in, you obviously end up going towards that party. Now, there is no proof that political parties circulate these videos. They create these videos or they circulate these videos. But we have also seen in many cases politicians actually retweeting these videos and actually helping the circulation in many cases without actually fact checking or verifying where this is coming from. So if they don't create it, they don't even oppose it, they don't even say anything about it. A very interesting thing that I will tell you is that when GST came in, the Ministry of Finance had to put an official notice on their website saying that all religious institutions are under GST for donations, and it's not just Hindu institutions. They had to officially make that statement because there was so much news circulating that only Hindu institutions are under GST and Islamic and Christian and other institutions are not. That was actually leading to a lot of online hate. And one very important thing for us to understand is that online hate is actually not just online. There are real world implications of that online hate. It only takes one person to be triggered by that online hate to actually go out and do something. And there is, YK also works with Facebook as a safety partner, and we have seen in many cases that, I'm just wrapping up in a minute. So we have seen in many cases that there are incidents that have happened where people have been followed, where people have been threatened in the real world because of something that's circulated online. There are solutions, of course, and there are solutions on both ends. Platforms like Facebook actually work on algorithms. It's not like a human being is sitting behind a computer and saying, oh, let's spread this video far and wide and let's take it to a lot of people. They work on algorithms. So if a piece of fake news is spreading a lot, Facebook algorithm will recognize that this is really popular. A lot of people love it. They're liking it. They're sharing it. Let's give it even more reach. So what ends up happening is that the algorithm in that case works in the favor of that fake news piece that is actually going out. So there is a certain amount of onus on the platforms as well. And to be honest, we work with Facebook to understand what that onus is, and it's not as easy because Facebook is a very large platform, but I don't think it's very difficult either for them to actually do something about it. The second thing is that there is a clear need for the media to be more aware, because a lot of this fake news actually becomes news later. And it's not just about fake news, it's about stupid news. I mean, I was seeing ABP News the other day, and they had this whole segment about Modi, Yogi ka nai, Yogi hairstyle, and Yogi ka nai kaun hai, Yogi kurta is in trend. And you know, all of this just kind of takes you completely away from good quality journalism that should actually serve a purpose of actually busting this fake news or bringing out the real stories. And that is completely going amiss. And you know, if you look at how polarizing mainstream media has become, it is a clear indication that we're actually very close to a point where a piece of fake news can actually lead to a big negative consequence. Just one final point: there are people who are doing some great work on fake news. There is an amazing website called Alt News, run by Prateek Sinha from Ahmedabad. He's doing a phenomenal job at busting fake news every single day. There is another website called Hoax Slayer, and a third one called Boom Live. All three of them are actually doing a phenomenal job. And I would say all of you, before you end up buying into something that's actually fake news, definitely go and check out these websites. Maybe they have a Mythbuster piece on what you're about to consume and what you're about to share. So that's just to kind of give a broad perspective, but happy to take on more in the questions. And there are actually a lot of legalities involved as well, which I'm sure Apar can add some perspective on.
Thanks. Thanks, Anshul. That was good. And I think if I can just add, just use common sense. I know a lot of people believe when the 2,000 rupee note came that there was a chip in it through which, you know, the PM or the Prime Minister could actually track whether you were,
But you know, the editor-in-chief of Zee News actually did a primetime show on it.
That's Zee News. That's Zee News.
But you know, but a huge chunk of people actually watch it. And I mean, we the thing is, we can't say that it's a particular channel, let's chuck it, because we absolutely can't, because people are actually consuming it a lot.
And it's vernacular, so it's actually reaching more than just the urban audiences. So I'll now call on Apar, who's a lawyer and a trustee at the Internet Freedom Foundation, who will actually talk a lot more about the solutions, including legal ones, which both Anshul and Dhruv have spoken about, and other ways to address this.
So it seems life was much simpler when we could walk into a bookstore and there was a fiction and a non-fiction section, so we knew what we were reading. So, but it seems as we increasingly turn towards a much more digital age, that there are dangers which are lurking all through it, and they enter our phone every morning with a good morning message. So, but you know, let us resist our elements to be Luddites. I would say, and just look at what the law has given till now, and is law more law an answer? And there is some humility to this exercise, because it's only been 2 years since a judgment by which the Supreme Court struck down a content restriction which was called Section 66A. And just going back to what was Section 66A, today there just seems to be some form of nostalgia. Let's have some law at least. Internet is completely unregulated and people are sending all kinds of messages over it, and it's overwhelming our democratic process. So let's have a law like 66A, a little more precise, a little more contoured, and it'll take care of this problem what we call is fake news. Now, if we do want to tackle a problem such as fake news, can we legally define it? And I would contest that if we would just write down what each one of us thought was fake news, and then saw the application of that definition with what's in our phone, it would astound us. Messages which would be even completely innocuous from our family members would fall within it. And this was what was the problem in Section 66A. It was a vague law which was made by the government and which was justified in the court as being vague because it was stated that information on the internet travels extremely fast and over vast regions, thereby has an incredible impact on large numbers of groups. And the court's answer to this was very direct, that the constitutional limitations which are under the constitution, namely under Article 19(2), are not elastic and cannot be stretched, and this requires any kind of restriction to be tailored, specific, and give adequate notice when it seeks to prohibit something. So what is fake news, and can we define it? Now, there is some work which is already ongoing by the UN Special Rapporteur on Free Expression, David Kaye, who's come out with reports noting that the recent fake news hysteria, in fact, ties in with a lot of existing criminal sanctions which are already existing under law. More precisely, hate speech sanctions, which are in existence except the United States in large number of countries, the US being a case of exceptionalism due to its First Amendment standard. There also being remedies for defamation, and India being one of the last remaining probably democratic countries which retains the criminal offense of defamation. And you can go through 12 other criminal offenses for speech which are listed in a decision of the Supreme Court about 3 years ago, which is called the Parivasi Bharatiya Sangathan versus Union of India, where a PIL litigant approached the Supreme Court and said that we need tougher sanctions for speech which is made contiguous to elections because they end up spurring violence. This was not precisely in the context of the internet on social media, but the court made a reference to the Law Commission, noting various provisions of criminal law which are applicable to speech. So I would make one point here, that the law is already incredibly regressive and censors speech extremely in India, at least in its substance. Now what's missing, and this is what we say with everything, from traffic to policing to municipal services, the problem is the implementation, right? And this indicates that we have a rule of law problem, that our problems are much deeper, much more structural. Now, drawing from what just Anshul stated, that is there a crisis in much more mainstream journalism? Are people doubting and not extending trust to much more conventional journalism sources? And then what differentiates a much more organized journalism setup from, let's say, santabanta.com, postcards.in, and these have tremendous viral reach, pggurus.net. So I think a lot of our problems are structural. Just one element in addition to speech I would like to also touch upon is with respect to privacy and how political parties are increasingly using our data. Now, India at present has very limited privacy protections in law. This is contained under certain provisions of the IT Act, which says and is based on a principle of consent, where a person such as us has very low bargaining power, given how our data is shared today with multitude of applications on our smartphone. We are tied to a standard I agree button and nothing beyond it. And most of us do agree and do not understand what we are agreeing to. Also, there is a complete absence to monitor how our data is being used and how those legal clauses which are drafted by lawyers are essentially being played out. So data points which are existing over multiple applications, multiple platforms are eventually up for sale and are giving a deep degree of insight into all of us individually. An absence of control by all of us to some degree aids this process, and ultimately it also may not be to our benefit. Now, what's required here is legislation, is regulation, but also maybe an answer from the Supreme Court in less than a month that what are the contours of the fundamental right to privacy. I'm presuming they will rule that we have a fundamental right to privacy. I would love to carry much more of these conversations offline. So please reach out. Thanks.
Thanks a lot for that, Apar. Now it brings me to the last speaker, Tamsil Hussain, who is an independent public engagement consultant. And he will actually talk about how you can engage millennials and Generation Z, let him define that, through social media and mobilize them, looking forward.
Wait, can I just?
Yeah.
So I think what I'll be doing is a lot of summarizing and providing very simple solutions and giving out a couple of jargons because I'm more emotional when it comes to talking than data driven because I'm into storytelling. I'm going to start with something which is very simple, which is a comment made by a friend of mine called Sumaya Omar in London yesterday during a mental health workshop. And she mentioned something which says engagement increases empathy and isolation kills it, right? And it's also inspired by the recent announcement made by Facebook that they have 1 billion groups on Facebook. Facebook groups are like smaller communities run by different influencers and different brands. Which brings me to the 5 current realities, right? And has been mentioned by all of the speakers differently. The first is 2017 began with the Edelman Trust Barometer. It actually says that people have the lowest trust in brands, lowest trust in media, lowest trust in politicians, lowest trust in government, lowest trust in institutions, lowest trust in social media, right? The second is young people. In 3 years in India, there will be 701 million young people, urban, rural, and living in different countries. These young people are very purpose-driven. They're very socially conscious. The only difference between an Indian young person and a person who's young anywhere in the world is that we are traditionalist and conservative at heart, right? And these people are in the age group of 18 to 35, right? Let's club them as millennials for this conversation. There's an age group which is called Generation Z, which is an age group which is below them, starts from 13 to 17. And these are kids who literally are born using social media, using technology. And for them, their minds are already being shaped by brands because they're so easily, you can reach them out easily, right? Like it's easier to reach out through Snapchat, Instagram, Facebook, different apps that they use, YouTube. It's so easy to shape their minds. The third is, The third is big data and micro-targeting, which I think Parag and Anshul and everybody has already mentioned, that we are vulnerable. 2019 elections are going to be fought on big data and micro-targeting because everything is becoming so digital. Digital India, we have so many things. We're being forced to connect our Aadhaar to our bank accounts, to income tax returns, all those things, right? Big data and micro-targeting is the future for winning any election. If you know the data, as Parag mentioned, I think it's easy to target people. Second is mobile phones, right? And there are 100 crore mobile subscriptions as we speak in India, and they're growing rapidly. The first thing they reach out to is WhatsApp. That's a messaging app that they download, most people. And after WhatsApp, it's Facebook, right? And that's the thing that's been threatening a lot of people, like vernacular media houses, politicians, opposition, current government. There's so many things that has been affecting is the increase in mobile phone reach. The third reality is the decline in broadcast media. Every month by month, the broadcast media figures are declining, right? And they're being forced to reach out to different screens. There's something called multi-screen engagement that they're forcing on. And they're trying to figure out, okay, I'm getting lesser revenue on broadcast. If I'm getting more revenue on broadcast than social media, why should I invest more in social media and less on broadcast? But then when they realize that the only way they can actually engage people after the age group that they'll be targeting in 3 years, which is like around 18 to 30-year-olds who are going to be most viewing the vernacular content out there, they're like, okay, maybe we should invest in social media. And the first thing they go into is Facebook, YouTube, and WhatsApp. One of the biggest things, again, comes is how do we actually mobilize young people knowing that we are the most vulnerable during 2019 elections. It's easy to manipulate an election. It's easy to digitally hijack an election. It's easy to manipulate, and there's so many vulnerabilities when you look at it. I think the first thing is there's so many people on social media and people who have been on social media. They're known as influencers, right? Let's call this term as influencers. Influencers are celebrities who are there. Influencers are people who manage WhatsApp groups. Influencers are people who enter a room, a cafe or a bar, and there's so many people who know them. They come and shake their hands. They all thrive on something that's called social capital. We're a generation which is literally grown up, right from the age of 13 to 30. Most people are grown up building a social capital. A social capital means that, hey, I have this much influence. I have 300 people that I can influence my thoughts on. And that's a trend which is growing on Snapchat. That's the trend that's what is going on Instagram, Facebook, WhatsApp. Just to give an example, I think the Patidar agitation that actually happened. was actually managed by 24 to 25-year-olds who were running WhatsApp groups to the social capital that they had, a completely organic movement, which actually had a leader towards the end because the movement was growing so big and it had so much of agitation. There was actually a leader put towards the end. Another thing to also think is that reclaiming public spaces, right? There's a point that we are on social media. There's a whole simulated angle to it. But there's a movement which was started, I think, in the 1990s. And for the last 5 years, placemaking is a movement which has actually grown really big in urban planners. It's now slowly combining with public engagement. And I know like a lot of political parties do this every election, but now there's actually a term coming to it. It's like making a place more community owned. And it's usually done in very urban areas. And it's usually done in like lower income areas. And now it's coming to the cities. People are reclaiming markets. A lot of those shop owners are slowly claiming markets. And there's a lot of engagement that's happening in those public spaces. Another thing that's also happening is because there's fake news, there's this rise of something that's been like really disrupting the media right now. How do you actually handle the broadcast decline? There's a rise of mobile journalism and mobile storytelling. I actually know, I've been to like political campaign meetings where the first thought is like, hey, these are our offline public engagement practices. These are the rallies we're going to do. These are the protests we're going to do. And this is actually just last month I was at a meeting. And like the first thing to say is, let's reduce all those activities to 10%. We're going to win an election with this. And how it actually works is, if you look at it, all the 5 current realities that I mentioned earlier and that all the other panelists have mentioned, a mobile phone has so much, it has more power and more reach than you can actually ever imagine, right? What we are seeing a rise is that more vernacular media channels and more mainstream media channels are slowly moving towards a trend from being creators of content to curators of content, which means there's a rise of citizen journalists. All these influencers and all these young people I've been talking about, they're like born storytellers, right? And we tell stories every day on Facebook, on Instagram, on WhatsApp. It's actually become a part and parcel of our life. But what's also happening is there's this team which is growing in every media house as we speak right now. NDTV just converted into a mobile journalism studio, specifically because it's reduced costs and it gives options to literally collect and crowdsource as much content as they can get from the citizens. And we're actually seeing, I mean, if you go on Hindustan Times Facebook page, you actually see the nature of a video becoming more raw. When they actually do a live video, that's the first thing that people actually realize, that it's like targeting fake news. It's not, I know this video is live. There's an individual who I know has a known face, is standing in a public space, telling me about something which I can actually believe in, right? And they judge and they have comment and direct interaction. And that is pretty much what's going to govern the media space in the next like 2 years. Mobile journalism, live videos. So if I actually have to say like what's the best way to mobilize young people for 2019, one is to use mobile phones, placemaking, public spaces, social media to actually influence the social capital. Because you already have influencers which are built in this country. There's 700 million of them who are going to be connected to technology to actually influence them to vote right, pretty much. That's what, yeah.
Thanks, Tansil. I don't know, I mean, that was great. I don't know how that makes me feel because I started off as a journalist in mid-2000s. Old school, very old school still. But no, I'm not not criticizing. I'm saying it's great. Oh. It's way forward. But I think I'll now open it to questions. We have about 20 to 25 minutes. If we have questions, if anybody wants to ask anything of any of the panelists. Yes, sir. Okay. Shall we take both questions together? Should we begin with you, sir? Can somebody give him a mic?
Do you have any study about the impact of social media on psychological behavior of the small children and people like this? What's the impact? Do you have any study?
Okay. Shall we take the second question as well? Should we take your question too?
Can I ask?
Okay, sure. Sorry, I didn't see you. Please go ahead.
I wanted to know what is the onus. Facebook discovered fake news only when Trump arrived and not really when Mr. Modi arrived, because in the scheme of things, India doesn't matter, actually. So when Trump arrived and fake news started circulating and supported his campaign, then Facebook discovered fake news. So what is the onus? I actually want to ask every panelist, what is the onus on Facebook and Twitter to take offensive or fake content off? And whether Facebook India, especially Anshul talked about working with Facebook.
Yes.
So it's whether Facebook India and Twitter India actually take off offensive content, because Alt News has done a lot of, for example, Ginny Khan account still runs.
Yeah.
Ginny Khan's account is still up there. And a question to Tamsil also, that journalists don't like the citizen journalism thing.
I agree.
Every citizen cannot become a doctor.
Actually, I'll also answer
Citizen journalism is dead. I mean, I don't know why you believe in
I would
it.
love to explain. I think when
Yeah.
we answer that, I would love to explain.
Have you seen a citizen doctor ever? I
Um,
mean, we train as journalists.
Okay,
Citizens
shall- shall-
cannot become journalists.
everyone.
Okay, shall we take the third question and then you'll answer all of them?
I'll actually give an
Hi,
example.
my name is Ganesh.
Hi.
My question is requested before Parag and Bhanu. So, Indian voting pattern is based on primary loyalties, that is based on caste, community, and religion. But since the penetration of television and now arrival of social media, do you see any change in the election narratives in terms of development, or are our politicians talking about the issues of development like hospitals, metros, roads? That is what my particular question is about, the content in the narratives on social media or the WhatsApp groups. Second is about where is the have you gone through the gender factor? I mean, how the women or the newly educated girls are voting right now. Thank you.
Shall we just begin with taking these questions? Who wants? Okay. Let's take your question then.
As actually most of the panelists talk about actually fake news, almost all of us we talk about, and we also talk about the consequences and the impact on the society. So I guess it from the user point of view, the way we are using all the mediums, all the social mediums, either phone or Facebook or other mediums. So it comes with the awareness. People will gradually they mature and then they understand the content of media, whether it's fake or not. So my question is, when, as per your research and experience, when you think that India will be that mature to take care of such newses, and what stage we are in, at least, when you think that after certain years, when we're going to mature enough to take care of such newses?
Okay, thanks. So shall we take this round of questions and then we'll take yours? Shall we begin with first question about what's the impact on young minds? Yeah.
No, if you have,
I think
go
it's the
ahead.
mental health. Can I, if you want
Yeah,
to
go
start,
ahead.
then,
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, you can actually. So I think specifically to that question, I was at a conference yesterday where you had like psychiatrists from all over the world, social media specialists, different people actually identifying how social media impacts mental health. And one of the two sides to it. One, there's a very positive influence, and second, there is a very strong negative influence. And the biggest question mark is that there are studies which say that social media is bad for psychological health and mental health, probably the worst platforms, and I think Instagram was named as number one. And but what was interesting, I think the biggest learning that I actually found out was that that study was done with just 2,000 people. And there are actually no proof, because you have communities like the Artidote, which is 1 million people who support each other, peer-to-peer support. But if I have to simplify this and actually say that, I think you can join a Facebook or a social media network, I think at the age of 13. That's if I'm not wrong, right? 13.
I mean, you can join it whenever.
Yeah, but 13 is the legal thing. But what I know is like a lot of, it's also about the way parents are letting their kids like access social media and by what age. And there's a lot of like peer pressure for them to access social media as quickly as possible. And what in most cases they access social media for the first time through their mother or father's phone to actually start using it. So there is a vulnerability there. Unless Anshul, if you want to talk about it.
Sure. So
Yes. It's a Blue Whale challenge. It's a gamified thing where you actually start playing. Yes, it's a huge threat. Like it's huge because more you actually had someone who committed suicide live on Facebook, right? A Blue Whale challenge is the challenge which originated in Russia. What you do is it's a nice game that you start playing, and the end of the game, you're asked to jump off the second floor of a building. You're so engaged with the game, and most kids doing it are like at the age of 12 to 6, I think 12 to 15, and you end up by the end of it committing suicide. And India had its first like life taken.
Sorry, interestingly, I think from if I'm right, sorry, just one second.
Yeah.
No
purpose.
Actually, I'd like to make a point. So, I'm sorry, but I'd like to make a point. One, there are two ways to look at this. One is that does social media lead to something like a young boy jumping off the second floor of a building? The other is to really look at what the reality is, because the reality is that when we were all much younger, there was a very popular show called Shaktiman, where Shaktiman would fly off buildings, and a lot of young people tried that, and they ended up jumping off buildings, and it led to their death. Specifically about the Blue Whale Challenge, I'd like to make a point, which is that the reason why a lot of young people globally are taking to this challenge, and there is enough investigation into the challenge that proves it, is that a lot of these young people already have mental health issues. And the bigger issue here is the society's negligence towards the mental health issue, and the young people finding solace in a challenge like Blue Whale Challenge to actually find a community of people who agree with them, or who are like them, or who are going through similar problems. So I think when we talk about social media leading to suicides or anything like that, I think we are looking at it from a very, very, very tiny point of view. We are not looking at the bigger problem at hand, which is the society generally just ignoring young people and their issues. So I think first, if we do want to solve something like that, we need to address that first. Coming back to your original question, does social media lead to depression, anxiety? What Tamsil said is actually true. Guardian actually leaked a report, internal Facebook report, which actually said that even Facebook knows it, that its platforms do lead to mental health issues in young people, a lot of anxiety, a lot of stress, a lot of depression, a big need for social validation, which adds on to all of that. But I think just specifically talking about social media leading people to jump off a building, I think we have a larger mental health crisis to deal with than to find avenues like social media to put the onus on. I think that's a fundamental thing that we need to understand.
I think also engagement, increasing empathy versus isolation. I think someone's wearing an "It's Okay to Talk" T-shirt. I was really happy to see that. It's a campaign which a lot of like campaigns to fight the stigma around mental health, as Anshul mentioned, are coming up, and It's Okay to Talk is one of them. It's a localized campaign as well. But I think there are two realities to also ensure that we keep in mind. The highest number of people that were live on social media was 2017. It's only going to grow. More people are showing their faces. More people are choosing to be on social media to gain that engagement and stay away from isolation. And I think the second point is that Facebook and Instagram and all these platforms are introducing suicide prevention tools as well. Yeah. It's still like, I think they've piloted a few, but there's a long way to go because these platforms actually have a huge responsibility. Now that 2 billion people are on them across the world, they need to like make sure like they're running it properly.
I've looked at this issue of online platforms growing over time, and initially it used to be stated that they are not publishers of any content, they are only intermediaries or dumb pipes, and they are facilitating whatever the user is putting out. So they are not playing the role of an editor, they are not curating content, they are not playing to certain social biases, good, bad, it's value neutral. Of course there are certain exceptions which are very clearly marked out, which included child pornography, which is not speech, it is actually a crime in itself. Now, as you expand the number of desirable categories of content, and you create more boxes in which you have to shut down other forms of content which is not socially desirable, you are giving incredible amounts of power to an online intermediary which acts as a central node to distribute content. And it's not the government, it's not accountable, it doesn't have an oversight mechanism. It's usually a white engineer in Los Angeles California who's doing all of this. So just think about it. How much power do you want to give away, and how much do you want to ask these platforms to police content by itself?
I think Anshul sort of addressed that as well. I think I completely agree with what he said. There is a larger mental health problem that is going on, and I think as a people we are very prone to, finding one thing and attributing blame to that one thing. Whereas the actual truth is, sure, I mean, social media is one way that young people can, are prone to impressions and sort of being influenced. But there are many such platforms. At the end of the day, the problem is not that social media is causing people to do something. The problem is that there are going to be many sources of information that young people consume. And at the end of the day, if we don't have a conversation with these young people, if we are not able to talk to them, if we are not able to understand what is going through their minds, currently we're talking about social media, maybe tomorrow we'll talk about, and before we were talking about TV, now we're talking about social media, something else will come up tomorrow, till we keep on dodging the actual question of why is it happening in the first place. I think there is more to that than just the source of the information. There is the root of the information is still not addressed.
Okay, so let's now come to the next two questions about the onus of Facebook and citizen journalism. So, Anshul, Tansir.
Honestly, I think Apar very well answered the onus question. It's actually, I mean, it's easy for us to demand that Facebook take down everything that we find objectionable, but it's a very hard call to take. How much power do we want to give a platform like Facebook or Twitter or any other platform? Because today it's content that you find objectionable, tomorrow can be content that somebody else finds objectionable that you find empowering. So it's really a tough call to take, and to be honest, I don't think I'm rightly placed to give the right answer, because we need to analyze this much beyond just a clear black or white. Citizen, unless you want to add something to the onus part, I would like to start on the citizen journalism bit.
It's more fun. No, actually, I think it's... I think we can move from the... Mostly, I agree with the Facebook point as well, but I think the onus is very simple. It's like, the onus is on us. We are using the platform. The more we call out, the more they'll be like, forced to change. But mostly I agree with what Anshul says.
Okay, so on the citizen journalism part, I feel very, very passionate about it because for the last decade I've been running a citizen journalism platform. We with all due respect, of course, journalism is very important and it needs to be done in the right way and so on. I think there are 2 or 3 important things here to understand. One is that it is a known fact that the traditional media has consistently failed citizens for 2 reasons. One is that news forever has always been centralized. It's never been democratized as be it creation or be it distribution. It's always been centralized. And what that has led to is that it has led to complete marginalization of several groups in the country and globally. Complete marginalization. Because if you're talking about professional journalists, we must accept the reality that you're basically talking about people in Delhi or Bombay. Because somebody sitting in Banda or Chitrakoot does not have the same access as the journalist sitting in Delhi or Bombay. That's number one. So journalism has been super centralized and it has not served the purpose it is meant to serve. The second is, I think we also end up being really, for the lack of a better word, but fairly elitist when we think that people do not actually know how to tell stories, because people very well know how to tell stories. I can give my own example. Youth Ki Awaaz has 75,000 stories. All of them have been verified, all of them have been fact checked. And we also do act as an intermediary. We also do have a set of community guidelines that define what stays on the platform and what doesn't. But what we have really seen is that the moment you give power to people to tell their own stories, the way those stories are told can actually empower way more people than your reporter or your journalist somewhere can. I don't think there is any platform when the West Bengal riot started that had personal narratives of people with proof, photos and videos of what was happening where the riots were going on. But if you go on YK, you'll find at least 12 or 13 of them, all personal narratives by people who we've sourced and fact-checked properly. Same with Kashmir, same with the Northeast, same with Banda, Chitrakoot, same with a lot of other areas. So I think the other point is that we completely like kind of become very central and elitist in our approach when we think that citizens, they don't have the ability or the power to create content. Now, of course, there are good doctors and there are bad doctors. There are good lawyers and there are bad lawyers. There are lawyers who will tell you, "Kya chodo, ghoos de ke khatam karte hain." There are lawyers that will tell you, "Chalo, let's fight for this." Same way, there are going to be people who will spread fake news and there are going to be citizens who will counter that fake news. So I think to classify citizen journalism completely out and say that it actually cannot lead to anything is completely wrong. And I can like go on and give examples of how actually citizen journalism has led to a lot. And the biggest example that I can give you is that what fueled India to rescue 16,000 people from Libya when the Middle Eastern crisis was going on was a citizen report of somebody whose father was stuck in Libya. Now comes the another very core point, which is that how do we actually define citizen journalism? Because there are platforms like maybe YK which have a few editors who are actually checking everything, but then at the end of the day, everything is citizen journalism. Instagram is citizen journalism, Snapchat is citizen journalism, Facebook, Twitter, Reddit, Pinterest, everything is citizen journalism. So we have to kind of accept and embrace the fact that people have the power to tell their own stories, and people will tell their own stories, and it's great that they have the power to tell their own stories. If there is anything that professional journalists should do, it is to identify the stories that deserve more outreach and pick those up and do proper fact-checked reports on them. So that is my perspective of citizen journalism, and I'm sure Tamsi can add
I think
some
it's
bits to it.
quite similar. Also, citizen journalism is a passé term, let's be honest. It's called Mojo now, mobile journalists. But
don't push your brand.
Anyway, so yeah, I think we're launching something called People Like Us Create, which is going to get launched in a month. It's about curating stories which are on social media, especially on Instagram and Snapchat. But, okay, so this is after dealing with 5 to 6 different media houses in North, South, vernacular, mainstream, working with their Mojo team, working with their digital team, working with their video team. And there's this huge, this huge anxiety which is there, that a journalist is supposed to find a story, produce a story, fact check it, push it out. And now this new thing which has come up is that what is the journalist's influence on social media? How many people, what is your community strength? What is your social capital, right? So I feel like an optimistic view to whatever Anshul said is, because this is exactly the case, is I think journalists have a more stronger role to play in this dynamic. Likes and shares are moving on to views. And a mobile journalist, a journalist can be a mobile journalist, a citizen can be a mobile journalist. Why? Because all of us have mobile phones, and mobile phones are getting more powerful. So I think like journalists can produce much better stories because they know how to do storyboard, they know how to find the content, they know how they have the sources. A citizen would do it if the person is present in a public space and has access to technology. So I think the power dynamics are the same, they've just evolved in a way. And if you look at it, I think if you look at how Quint produces stories, how Hindustan Times produces stories, how a lot of other channels are now beginning to move towards it, how NDTV is now producing stories. I think I had a friend who was watching NDTV on incognito mode online recently. So it's moving towards it, whether we like it or not. It's a multi-screen world that we're living in. CNN did this. Guardian had to literally fire so many of their staff. India is now being forced to do this because in 2 years, elections are on. And the faster we penetrate into WhatsApp and mobile phones, the faster we become, the easier it becomes to tell stories. I mean, broadcast views are declining, revenues are going down massively, and there's no way to find out how can we earn revenue out of social videos. So I think, like, I don't know if it does, but a journalist still has way more power to tell stories than a citizen. But at the same time, the citizen is in a public space where the person has the social capital. So it all boils down to that, I feel.
I think that's answered.
Actually, we have one question from there that's unanswered.
I know. So no, I was telling her that's answered. Now it's your question about narratives and the gender factor for Bhanu and Parag.
Yeah. Okay. If you guys have been following this discussion throughout, the sense that you will take away is that political parties are basically evil and social media is the tool that they have for world domination and all that. But social media and political parties do a lot of good together also. Let me just put this in perspective. 20 years back, a lot of us in this room and a lot of people, let's say in Banda or Chitrakoot, would have never dreamt that they would speak to their representatives. They could directly ask the Prime Minister something, or they could directly ask their Member of Parliament something. They would have never thought that they could engage, they could question them, they could ask them for help. And these are things that have changed, and this has happened because of adoption. Now, coming to the narrative question, narratives have definitely changed, and social media has played a big role in this. If you look at the primordial narratives like caste, okay, this caste votes for this party, and this keeps on happening. Like Bhanu would attest to this fact when he was in Bihar and in UP. There are a lot of these caste equations. Anybody you speak to, okay, this party cannot win because they have this people from this caste, but this caste never votes for this caste. But this has changed. This has completely changed. There are some undercurrents of caste politics still there, and that will always stay because it's the same thing. But the narrative has actually moved to class, and slowly this is happening. And a lot of people don't realize that rich versus poor, like Apar or Anshul mentioned, elitist versus people who are not elitist, and this happened in the US context also. So the narratives have changed because on social media it's very difficult to push caste. Primarily because most people do not carry their caste tags on social media. They are all equal. Sometimes they use a different name. They will use a pen name. It's very difficult to catch this person. Okay, this is doing a caste-based division, like targeting on social media is very difficult. So if you want to push content for a specific caste on social media, it's going to be very difficult. You can't do micro voter targeting along the caste lines on social media. So there are different metrics, and narrative has adjusted accordingly. And like you asked specifically for women, it's actually a big thing. You can actually do micro voter targeting for women on social media. And a lot of parties, for example, since Bihar elections, take women very seriously now. It's something that has changed since the prohibition promise of Nitish Kumar and the large support of women he received has changed the equation a little in favor of women. Earlier, the conventional wisdom was that the women vote how the men of the household tell them to vote. Like the husband will tell the wife how to vote, but this has changed. You ask people, they say, we don't know, this person might vote for somebody else. They don't know about voting preferences in the family, and this not just in cities but in villages too. The husband cannot guarantee that the wife is going to vote for the same party he's going to vote for. So it's very different now.
Anu, you want to add something?
I agree with most of Parag said, but I think 2 points. I think it's good that political parties are going ahead and are conducting surveys before elections, post elections. Before we sort of met in this room, I was talking to Parag about what are the plans for Odisha, and I was just inquisitive whether there are surveys and whether political parties. So I think this is an interesting trend, because I guess it's a nice way for political parties to also know what their people are thinking, who the opinion leaders are, so on and so forth. as far as the specific question that the gentleman asked on, is development a part and parcel of these, WhatsApp videos and so on and so forth? It really is context specific, and I think that, two very sort of interesting examples come to my mind, and I think that is also alluding to the larger point that most people here are making. Let's not kid ourselves and think that what is appearing in social media is not a product of deeper social cleavages and divisions within our society, right? Yeah. Most of the stuff that is coming on and off media are existing biases, which I guess are perhaps, increased or at times. So, the Patidar Andolan, right? And then the Maharashtra chaps, right? Who are demanding, the Jats as well, for instance, who are demanding reservation. The entire sort of Dalit movement in the country, right? So the point I'm trying to make is that a lot of the videos which circulate either sort of reinforce those biases or they cut those biases, right? In Punjab, coming to elections, election campaign, as Parag would perhaps agree, is who is going to win, and can I convince this voter to switch his vote from this other party to my party? So this is a very sort of interesting example. Punjab elections happened in a single phase, and 2 days before the Punjab elections happened, an audio went viral, I got that audio from 3 different sources in 3 different places, and that audio essentially had the former Chief Minister of Punjab begging his Halka in charge, who's the constituency in charge in his own constituency, Lambi, saying that meri laaj rakh lena, and this election is very important to me, and please bring people out to vote, right? Now, this was clearly used by a political party, which was contesting the other political party, to sort of create a narrative about, these guys are losing, right? We are the winners. The same happened in UP after the first phase. Another audio went viral where Mr. Amit Shah was seen talking to people from the Jat community, assuaging them, saying that I'm sorry that Mr. Modi couldn't come, to sort of revere Mr. Charan Singh, so on and so forth, and that you will get your dues for the sugarcane prices, so on and so forth. And this again, sort of audio went viral. The point I'm making is that when it comes to social media, a lot of times, particularly in terms of elections, I think the aim is to sort of put your point of view, saying that we are winning, and hence, this sort of. So yeah, that's probably it. As far as the women vote, Nilanjan is here, and I would strongly recommend you guys to read his paper where he sort of looked at, do women voters, and unfortunately we've not had much scholarship on that subject. How do women voters vote differently than men voters? And I agree with Parag to a certain extent that Nitish's victory in Bihar sort of propelled this idea that prohibition had a good sort of role, and I'm not sure if that's a great sort of example for other political parties, but it does have a sway in amongst the political parties. Yeah. No, but it was promised by Nitish Kumar in his manifesto, and so was, for instance, in Tamil Nadu before the elections, a lot of other parties demanded prohibition, and it is only after that Jayalalitha decided that I will go ahead with prohibition. But that's beyond the point, and I think that I'm really happy that Banda and Chitrakoot were mentioned many more times than I've heard anywhere in Delhi. So Khabar Lahariya and Gaon Connection are these 2 newspapers which do excellent sort of work, which you guys should definitely go back and read.
Okay, we are running out of time. I know your question is left. Let's take the last 2 questions or 3 questions. That's it. Okay, whatever. Very quickly, let's club the questions and close it then. Because I think we are, it's Premola here. Can we run extra by 10 minutes?
So one question is regarding, one to Parag. He talked about, the influence of social media and how important it is, the social media is for political parties. At the same time, we had Bhanu telling you that the sample size is still whatever, the fancy around it, but the sample size is still very small. So why do we at all? Probably pragmatism, the pragmatic thought is still it's too low. So how much importance that you can actually give towards 2019? Still, I would like Parag to answer if that given the situation, what is your assessment of its impact, fake, whatever, social misinformation on the current democratic processes, decision making, public opinion? That is one. Second is about the the fellow participants talked about the onus. Now, each one of you have not really, have probably had a consensus on, that it's very, very scary to give too much of power to these platforms itself. Nonetheless, are they really, whatever that they're doing, is it really sufficient? Are they doing enough? One. And second, like in case, I think, in UK, after the consecutive terror attacks, there was this parliamentarians asked these social media representatives to come, and they were questioning them, and I think one of the member of parliament asked, I think the Twitter or probably the Google guy, the YouTube guy, that you earn a lot of money from hate videos, and so don't you have shame? So he was very, very direct, and he was very, very he was very, very, angry when he asked this. And we see it in India too, the fake news and the news which creates sensation and hate. You actually, you have a lot of ads showing there. So these platforms are making money out of, they have an incentive to really. So yeah. So
yeah. Okay. She's been raising her hand for a while now.
Thank you. My question is also for Parag and perhaps for the panel in general. That as political parties are both beneficiaries but also victims of fake news, and they collect all of this big data on which they're going to fight the next election, what can they do with this big data to have behavioral nudges for people to become more discerning about the news they consume, beyond the law, beyond sort of the implementation of the law, but really sort of more social and political nudges using the big data that they have?
Yes, go ahead.
So we spoke a little bit about like some of the legal solutions and some of the technical solutions for fake news. And some of the technical ones are basically like these alternative websites, like altnews.com or whatever, but we didn't really address the potential cognitive burden that people may have to take to be the, to look for these alternative sources.
Yeah.
And what do you guys think about some solutions, other technical solutions that could be like, I was just brainstorming like a paid platform for Facebook where it creates a different algorithm that doesn't generate fake news, or, there is a demand for it clearly in the room. Like I would pay for a paid platform. So what about like other such platforms that maybe are like slightly less democratic, but other technical solutions?
Yeah, that's the last question.
Hello everyone, I am Mayur from Delhi College of Arts and Commerce journalism student. I only want to ask one question, that do you all think that it is practical to have a strict law against fake news? Because I think that if there is a strict law, then the one thing that all the news channels and media institutions will say that there is a curb on freedom of speech. So I want to ask that is a strict law against it can work for it?
Okay, thanks. Which question would you guys like to take first? I mean, can we take yours at the end if that's okay? Because it's like a little bit of a summary question. I think
impact question.
There was an impact. So do you want to take that, Parag?
Yeah. So in terms of impact, how much impact does it have? It's absolutely impossible to measure in any context how much impact social misinformation has on election results. Especially in Indian context where elections are, if you take a state assembly election, it's not presidential on most occasions. So the social misinformation may have had impact on one constituency, but when you look at the let's say you take UP for example, there are 403 assembly constituencies. So if there is some misinformation in a particular phase, so it might affect a few constituencies in that phase, and by the time you go into other phases, the narrative's completely changed and there's a completely different kind of equation running around there. So if we take the US examples and put them in the Indian context, this question naturally arises, because in US context this received so much publicity, the fake news sites, people making money like somebody mentioned, and they did actually make a lot of money. And I read some article where there were these kids from Macedonia who ran a lot of this fake news, and they don't know who Trump is, they don't know who Clinton is, didn't matter to them, so they were out there to make money. So in that context you can probably say that it had a huge impact, but nobody is sure. In Indian context, I think the impact is much lesser, considering elections are not fought the same way elections are fought in US. And then immediately I'd like to club that question. Political parties are beneficiaries and victims of fake news, so what are they going to do with fake news? I think the road forward is going to be they have to start self-regulating or debunking each other. If let's say BJP starts a fake news thread against Rahul Gandhi, Congress is going to start debunking it, and Congress is going to start spreading its own thing until both parties achieve some kind of equilibrium. This is the only I am not sure if you're aware, advertising standards are self-regulated. So if Pepsi says something misleading about Coke, so Coke goes to the ASCI, I think it's called, and they sit down together and they determine, okay, we are not going to advertise along these lines. Election Commission kind of plays that kind of role. So every time you have to send an IVR message to people, or every time you have to put up a campaign ad or something, you have to go to the Election Commission, and Election Commission generally lets these ads and IVRs go through unless some other political party opposes them. So I think we'll move towards a mode of self-regulation eventually, and where, so that's why the role of an opposition is so important, right? Or different multi-party system is so important, because each party is going to keep a check on the other, and you will reach a state of equilibrium where it doesn't work. But this will not work if one party has unlimited resources at its disposal and the other party does not match up to that. So if a party is running 20,000 WhatsApp groups and it has money to pay for that, and the other party can only maybe make 20 WhatsApp groups, so then you know there is a power dynamics there. But fortunately, although many in this room wouldn't believe it, in India that's not the situation.
Okay, does anybody else on the panel, I'm leaving the onus and regulation questions out because they have already been answered. Anybody else on the panel wants to take the question about political parties being victims and beneficiaries and behavioral nudges? Tech solutions other than what's existing about paid platforms?
Just one quick point. Google actually did say sometime early this year that they are going to do something. They are going to actively build an algorithm to identify fake news and then not let it surface in the search results, at least on the first page or something like that. So I think Google is definitely trying. Even Facebook is trying to counter fake news. We don't know how, but they definitely have an initiative that they have launched to counter fake news.
Okay, and your question in the end, when will India mature to be more discerning, right? Does anybody want to answer that?
It's anybody's guess.
So it's anybody's guess?
Yeah.
Yeah.
See, also there's no way to know what is the stage that, how do you define what is mature? How do you define where, it's always, it's a continuous process.
Meaning the literacy rate of India is about 40% overall.
Yeah.
So when it reaches 75% like in Germany or other Scandinavian countries, the things can change.
Absolutely,
That's
absolutely.
a simple answer, nothing else is said.
Absolutely.
When you talk about technology, so there are companies who evaluate them, right?
Yeah, of course.
Is there any, and when we are talking about social engineering, so there are companies like Gartner is another, CII, ASSOCHAM, right? So they are basically evaluating. So is there any company who evaluates the impact of social on this one and the maturity of level of Indian users?
I don't know. There's a company called Cambridge Analytica which did tremendous work in the Trump campaign.
Which actually mentioned in my intro, which is actually notorious. But
yes.
Okay,
can I ask one simple question? The election in France, election in America,
yes, sir.
And when they talk against the system, or when the person is away from the system, there is even the media with the even you call it media which has been bought by the system, even they supported Clinton or the other people. But when it is against the system and the system is not doing well, so how this small segment of social media can be helpful in garnering votes from the lower strata? So how do you feel that can play a vital role, and how is that functioning? So does the lower strata takes the social media system into such a fashion that it upheavals the entire bot media system? So is that very dangerous, or is it good for the system? Is the subject?
Why are you assuming that?
And one thing I would like to tell you, the viral is a paid. It is not automatically viral. Once you pay, but it should have a substance of being viral. Once you pay, you can be viral anytime.
So it can be both ways, and we really have to close it. Yeah. If you want to answer it, and then we can close this.
I mean, I don't know why do we assume that there's a direct connection between literacy and our voting choices, or for that matter, any other choices that we make in life. I think that this doesn't really matter. And as far as, I think, let the fact be well established. There are a lot of conversation around whatever is the viral media and source, etc. is propagated by people and institutions and sources who want to reshape the environment. And who gets involved? I mean, what happened in Noida, for instance, right? In an apartment which is clearly owned by a lot of us stay in those apartments. I mean, what sort of whatever the gentleman referred to as the lower strata would have sort of how can anyone sort of justify what happened there? Right? So the point I'm making is that it's really not sort of.
Okay, so with that we're closing it. Thank you, Bhanu, Anshul, Apar, Tamsil, Parag, Dhruv, and I just want to make one point before I end. When I put this panel together, I was told it's a manel, and I'm the only woman, but just shows the definition has changed. It's probably the best manel I've been on.
Not sure. Never a good manel.
No, I will.
I hope it changes further.
It is. It is. Have you worked?